Okay, so the next thing I'd like to go over is I'd like to see if there are any questions on week 3. I know you did posts about this, discussion posts, and if you ask me a question in there, I'll answer it that way. But here we started the abstinence assignment. We talked about alcohol and tobacco, which are pretty much the most common addictions. The general cycle of addictions, a lot of website resources, medication for the treatment of alcohol, the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous book. These are some PowerPoints, videos from the library, a TED Talk, a few articles, and more on opioids. So any comments or questions on last week? All right. So let's look at this week, this coming week that I just posted. All right. So there's a number of different topics for this week. I think one of the most interesting topics is codependency, and we'll talk a lot about that. I'm just going to give you an outline for this week, and you can have codependency with any addiction. It the concept began with Alcoholics Anonymous or Al-Anon. And then we're going to talk a little bit about stimulants, and I have PowerPoints for prescription stimulants, non-prescription stimulants like cocaine and crack, and opioids, which are narcotics. So the main thing I want to point out is that you've got your normal Dreamland my response. It's a recorded response. I have a video lecture on medicated opioid treatment and detox. Then I have tons of articles. And if you read this first, or under this first article, it says, you don't have to read every article on opioids. I put a ton in there. Pick a couple that you find interesting. So just read 2 or 3. There's at least 10 articles there. And they're on a lot of different topics. So for instance, methadone, other treatment drugs, an opioid treatment study with a tapered response. Wow, that sounds really close to your paper. Other medicated treatments. Yeah, so you can pick what you want. I'd probably read that one I pointed out, though, the tapered response treatment study. Other than that, here's one on comorbidity, methadone and comorbidity. And just make sure you watch my lectures that are recorded. So that's kind of what's on tap for this coming week. I didn't want you to be overwhelmed by the amount of journal articles and that you'll have to write a discussion post on each one of these articles. Just pick a couple. And so let's talk about codependency. So if you look at Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book, and you can read the story of Bill, the guy who wrote the book. And so I found it very interesting that it was his family that came up with the concept of codependency. I didn't know that was the origin of codependency. So before the term codependency, before it was tied to addiction, the entire concept began with a family systems theorist, Murray Bowen. And I thought everybody would give him credit for that. But really, he didn't coin that phrase, and I knew that. But he came up with a lot of the different, I guess, dimensions of codependency. So he never named it, but when he talked about multi-generational family systems, so much of the dysfunction that he defined within a family system also occurs in codependency. So let me give you an example, okay? And this happens to me with clients all the time. So, I'll have, there'll be a person who grew up in a dysfunctional family and the parents were codependent. And by codependent, it means that they have taken on a lot of the attributes that happen in multi-generational family systems dysfunction. So that would include things like, in this case, probably addiction, but it doesn't have to include addiction. It could be that you have a codependent and a narcissist. It could be that you have a codependent and an addict. It could be that you have a codependent and somebody with another diagnosis. So there's all different ways to have a codependent relationship. But probably the two most frequent occurrences are either with addictions or narcissistic diagnoses. So, all right, so let's say, parents were, one was either an addict or a narcissist or both. They might be, self-medicating some deep-seated issues. But, and the other one was codependent. And I would actually say that both were codependent, but in different ways. Because it's like this magnetism. They tend to find each other because they're seeking that type of personality, really. So multi-generational family systems, it includes dysfunctions like triangulation, handing dysfunction down through the generations, and with each generation, it becomes more profound. It could be emotional cutoffs if somebody doesn't get what they want. So when we're thinking about this, the codependent individual really seeks external validation. And more than just somebody who needs, oh, I really need an A. Like, they don't really feel good about themselves until somebody else, says something good about them, or they get the attention that they desire, or in their mind, it's love. Okay. But that love is never truly fulfilling because there's all of these conditions surrounding it. So growing up in this household, the children learn how to be one side of the codependent relationship pretty well. Nobody's taught them how to be in a healthy relationship. And so when they're out in, working or going to school or whatever it might be, they will meet somebody that's very similar to one of their parents. And it'll be like they've known each other forever. They feel so comfortable with one another, and they feel comfortable because they understand what the expectations are, and the other person fulfills their own expectations to some degree. So what happens is they get together very quickly, and the relationship progresses more quickly than it probably should. They probably move in together. They, you know, have, you know, uh, begin intimate relationships more quickly. And so they bond very quickly, and they don't take into consideration everything else that goes into a relationship because they feel so comfortable with this other person. And some of them would describe it as a soulmate because they feel so comfortable, like it was meant to be, like this person really gets me. But it's really because they match up with the dysfunctional personality and attributes of a parent. So time goes on, and you know, uh, perhaps the addiction gets worse. It plays into the relationship. The other person is not feeling secure anymore because they're not getting their needs of external validation met, because what is getting the external attention? The addiction. Yeah. There may be arguing, and then one person might begin with emotional cutoff. I'm just not going to feel anything. The other person, who may be a little more manipulative in the relationship, decides to triangulate, and the first thing they get is cat or a dog. Yeah. Oh, wow, how cute is this cat or dog, kitten or puppy? And that's all great until they have to house train the dog, and the dog gets bigger, and they can't really, uh, live as freely because they got to walk that dog. Um, and, so this animal ends up adding more stress. And rather than separating or going to counseling or addressing their issues, they decide to bring triangulation into the picture again. And what happens? Let's have a kid. And while you've got like 9 months of anticipation, and the other person hopefully is somewhat caring and giving the other person the attention that they need, the addiction may subside for a little bit, maybe not, depending on how advanced it is. And there's a lot of positive anticipation building to having the baby. And then, the first few hours, maybe, this baby is so cute, and they're getting a lot of attention from family and friends, and maybe a baby shower. And then somebody's got to stay up all night when that baby wakes up crying. And then you add sleep deprivation to the mix. And one person may not be sharing the responsibility, and the other is taking on too much of the responsibility. So what was anticipated to be uh, somewhat of a stress reliever became more stressful once again. And eventually, emotional cutoff comes in again, and they begin to drift apart. Wow, I really thought you understood me. You don't understand me at all. I thought we were partners. Wow, you're not an active member in this family. You're more concerned about drinking than, helping with the baby or household chores or anything else. And I don't feel the same way. And so more time spent at the bar where everybody knows your name, and more time feeling isolated and alone with a baby, a dog, and a cat. And then, you know, the individuals are codependent, so they probably don't want to go off on their own. They don't want to seek counseling and separate and all that. That's a scary thing. So one person in the relationship makes a friend, and they can really talk to each other, and they can tell them all their problems and the problems in the relationship and how isolated they feel and everything else. And you know what? It's like they've known that friend forever. And so the cycle continues. That friend becomes more than a friend and takes the place of the previous partner. And yet it's the same partner because it's just another codependent relationship. The codependent relationships move in these cycles and they're continuous. One relationship ends, another one begins. And, you know, so, and nobody gets the help they really seek or need. And so, you know, and so not only does codependency cycle through an individual's life over and over again, but it'll cycle through children's lives because that's the relationship they learn. And it's passed down multi-generationally. And so, but the first people to coin this phrase are, Bill's wife and kid. And it's really about how this affects families. And they coined the phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous, codependency. And it really talks about how addiction impacts other people. Now, since then, more recently, the move has, because everybody understands addiction and codependency, the move has really gone more towards narcissistic personalities and codependent relationships. And I put a article on here about narcissism and about the origin of codependency. But I'd be interested to hear what anybody thinks tonight, or you can put it in your discussion posts about codependency. All right, so let's talk about stimulants and the there's two different PowerPoints here, chapter 8 and chapter 9. And one of them is on stimulants that are prescriptions, and the prescriptions are misused. And the second one is about stimulants that are not legal, like cocaine, crack, meth, things like that. So there's really two things we're dealing with. Yes, we had a cocaine epidemic, we had a crack epidemic, and now we have a prescription stimulant epidemic. It's uh, one of the rising causes of a lot of national problems. And so, and there's two library videos on stimulants. And this is a pretty interesting document, Misuse and Diversion of Stimulants Prescribed for ADHD, a systematic review of the literature. So, let's talk about that first. So in my DSM class, I talk a lot about overdiagnosis or overprescribing medications for diagnoses. And just because I'm on this bandwagon, this is my disclaimer. Don't take this personally. If you have any diagnosis like ADHD, I'm not talking about you individually. I'm sure your diagnosis is right on target, and whatever meds you're taking work for you. But let's just talk in general, okay? So don't take this personally. Um, it's one of the uh, most common diagnoses in America. You got anxiety, depression, ADHD, and bipolar. Um, and a lot of times, uh, the first move is to medication for those diagnoses, rather than any type of other therapeutic treatment. Um, and many times, the schools will refer or recommend or suggest to a parent, maybe you want to have them evaluated for ADHD. Oh, it's really hard for this kid to sit 8 hours at a desk in a class when they're like 10 years old. So um, then they go to a family doctor rather than a psychiatrist. And usually the forms they use, they've been rewritten now because it got so much criticism that most of the diagnosis checklists were put out by the pharmaceutical companies that produced Ritalin, one of the first ADHD medications. Um, One of the things they don't take into consideration is the severity of the criteria and symptomology. Um, So severity is really the key factor when diagnosing ADHD, severity of the symptomology. So with all that being said, well over 90% of all diagnoses, well over 90% of all medication is prescribed in the United States. The rest of the world is under 10% of the diagnoses, under 10% of the medication prescribed. So when we're thinking about this, there is a lot of medication out there in the United States. And we have Ritalin and Adderall, and we've got two different drugs being uh, used. Um, and, so when we're thinking about these stimulants, they're readily available to kids. If it's not your own, you've got a friend who's got them. And uh, if you don't have ADHD and you want to stay up, or you want to focus and study, or you want to take too many and get, a little buzz, um, you can just ask a friend, hey, give me some Ritalin, give me some Adderall. And it's usually free because you got a friend. So this is the new I don't want to call it an epidemic, but concern for young people. And by young people, it's anybody, basically from elementary school through the end of college age. So, 23, you got like 8 years old to 23-year-olds. Um, and because it's so readily available. Now, if you look at the opioid epidemic, the number one reason it became an epidemic is it was so readily available that people who would normally not use an opioid tried the pill. And a pill doesn't seem like, oh, I'm not injecting it, it's just a pill. Well, how bad can a pill be? We America takes a lot of pills, so a pill is like nothing. So we don't think it can hurt us in the same way as smoking something or injecting something or snorting something. A pill seems harmless. Uh, so I just want you to look at some of these things and realize that, hey, you're going to get some clients that, uh, whether they have ADHD or not, they're misusing these prescriptions. That's the whole point of this. And that maybe they're too readily available. All right. So let's talk about the illegal substances. Um, so uh, cocaine and crack, just two versions of the same thing. One and crack is more smokable. It's already, it's gone through another process so that it's has less impurities, it's more smokable, and it's much more potent as well. It's more potent for a few different reasons. Uh, Not only has it taken out any impurities, uh, but it's the way individuals use it. So when people smoke something, it goes directly into the lungs and all the capillaries in the lungs, just like they take in oxygen, and it's immediately taken to the bloodstream and the brain without losing much of it in the process. So, you breathe in oxygen, your lungs filter it, it goes directly into the bloodstream and to the brain. There's a direct connection with inhalation uh, as a way to deploy this drug. Whereas if people snort cocaine, um, they're getting less than 50% in their bloodstream uh, because it constricts capillaries in the nasal cavity. So, yeah, there is a direct passage to the bloodstream through nasal cavities, you know, but it constricts them. So then you get less the more you use. Uh, Also, a lot of times it'll go through the liver, depending on how you take it. That filters out a lot. Um, and, you know, so you're losing a lot by the way you intake these drugs. So I want to tell you a story. Well, first of all, let's tell you a little history. So one of the first documented experiences of cocaine use is by Freud. And so there was a large influx of cocaine into Europe and America uh, when it first became popular. And so they didn't know how addicting this was. They thought it was a miracle drug. And remember, Freud was a doctor. And so when he first heard about this, he only heard about the benefits of it. And he realized that after trying it, it did relieve some of his anxiety. It settled his stomach. He felt like he could write all day. Uh, and But then after a while, he ran out. And it was one of the first times, other than smoking cigars and pipes, that he felt like he needed the drug and he realized, oh, this is addicting, and he quit. Now, only later in his life, when he had throat cancer from his other addiction, which was tobacco, he used cocaine again, but for medical reasons to reduce the pain in his throat. So he did realize that it could be used for legitimate medical reasons at that point. So the second way, and this is like one of the ways it became most popular in America, is that an average 8-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola had about 60 milligrams of cocaine in it. So if you get a 16-ounce, that's about 120 milligrams of cocaine. And wow, this beverage is great. It's better than an energy drink. So, it was some people think that's a myth, but that's why Coke's called Coke after all. And so what they did was they mixed coca, which is, where you get cocaine from coca leaves, with cola, and that's why they call it Coca-Cola. Um, All right, so let me give you my personal example. Uh, so in the Himalayas, maybe you see like mountain climbing movies with like Sherpas who grew up in like Nepal in the mountain region. Well, they're at a pretty high altitude and there's less oxygen at that altitude. And over many generations, their lungs and entire bodies have actually changed to adapt to that environment that has less oxygen at higher altitudes. So they're able to retain and process oxygen much better than somebody who lives at a low altitude uh, and goes to the Himalayas. So great, good for them. When I was in Peru, in the mountains in Peru, I was doing some mission work there. And then after the mission work, I decided to stay a couple more weeks and do some sightseeing. And the people who live at high altitudes in Peru discovered coca leaves, and they chew them all day long, not to get high, because chewing a coca leaf, it will help you a little bit, give you energy and things like that. But what it really does is it opens up the capillaries in the lungs and allows more absorption of oxygen at higher altitudes. So they didn't have to change physically in order to adapt to that climate. They found a plant that would help them. So here I am. I've been there all summer, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go sightseeing. I'm going to go up to Lake Titicaca, which is the highest lake in the world, and they have floating islands made of reeds. And I just thought it was fascinating and a cool thing to see. And so I'm up there, and it's like somewhere between 11 and 14,000 feet. And when I was younger, I was in pretty good shape, but I was a little older then. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought I was having a heart attack. I couldn't breathe. And I was like, my heart was racing because it wasn't getting enough oxygen. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I know, I had climbed the mountain beside Machu Picchu that day before. And so it actually overlooks Machu Picchu. And I'm like, I know I was tired, but I don't think I'm like that out of shape that I'm going to have a heart attack. And so I stumbled down the stairs of this lodge, and they had a really old computer that was tied into some internet. And I type in, all of my symptoms, and Wikipedia pops up and it says, oh, these are the symptoms for altitude sickness. For example, tourists staying at Lake Titicaca may experience these symptoms unexpectedly. And I'm like, wow, this is like talking about me. And so the guy who, it's the middle of the night, the guy who showed me to this computer, I said, look, I tried to explain to him I'm like having altitude sickness, and he's like, he doesn't care. I guess this happens every day with stupid tourists. And so he's like, sit, have some tea, have some tea. And so I had like 6 cups of this tea, and it was coca tea. And I was feeling a lot better after that tea. I was able to breathe. Um, and I had a happy little buzz. Uh, Unexpectedly, I didn't go to sleep for the rest of the night, but I felt a lot better. So that's my personal experience with it. Um, so let's see. Um, so cocaine is not as popular anymore. And one of the reasons for that is they've been putting fentanyl in everything. They used to only put it in opioids, but now they put it in so many different things, and there's no reason to. So it's pretty dangerous at this point, taking a chance on, what you don't know what they put fentanyl in. But crack is making a little comeback. We don't know why exactly, probably because it became a lot cheaper in comparison to other drugs, and there's been a crackdown on opioids, and a lot of people either moved to or started with cocaine and then crack. So, let's see. There's videos on here for the opioid section. Read just a couple articles, not all of them. Here's the discussion board. Here's the instructions for the final paper. And yeah, so that's about it. Any examples or questions or anything you'd like to ask or talk about?
Whenever we had brought up how using diets, if you think of kind of the parallel between the overproduction of ADHD meds and of opiates, it made me think of parallels because I remember last summer whenever we just ran out of Adderall in some places.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't fill a prescription here. And whenever I was talking with people at the pharmacy, they said probably because so many people are just being diagnosed with it and just getting medicated just like that.
Yeah. So Sage is making a parallel between kind of the overproduction of opioid pills and the epidemic there, but also kind of the comparison between, okay, there's so much medication being produced for ADHD and so many diagnoses being made. I will say that as I followed this, so, I was around before they had these medications, and as they invented new medications like Ritalin, diagnoses became prominent. And then they invented Adderall, because they invented Adderall because the patent on Ritalin ran out. So if your patent runs out, you can make a generic, which you make a generic for nothing. You don't make a lot of money on a generic. So then they came out with Adderall. They got that patent. And but then they started coming out with new medications for bipolar, and diagnoses for ADHD went down and diagnoses for bipolar skyrocketed. And it's not just ADHD or bipolar. This happens with any diagnosis. I'm just using these as examples.
And Vyvanse has some of the highest efficacy rates for treating ADHD, and it's one of the least addictive. It's the hardest one to get approved by insurance companies, and you have to go through all the addictive ones to get to it.
Do you think that's because like it's more expensive, or I wonder why? I don't know why that is. All right, other comments or questions? All right, we will see you all, and have a good week.
Thank you.